today's speakers. We have a great panel of NLI experts joining us today. Our first guest is an experienced consultant in our diversity and inclusion practice. She advises organizations about topics ranging from belonging and inclusion to bias, diversity, and allyship. Dr. Paulette Gurkovich. Hello, Paulette, are you there?
I am here. Great to be here, Gabe.
Thank you. Welcome. Our second subject matter expert is our Senior Vice President of Corporate Solutions. He speaks to HR executives daily about their D&I challenges and can speak to how NLI clients are making efforts to act boldly. Marshall Bergman. Hello, Marshall.
Hey, Gabe. Nice to see you. And how's my audio sound? Am I all right?
Yep, you sound great. Thanks for joining us. And today's session will be facilitated by NLI's VP of Consulting Practices and Research. You'll probably recognize him from a number of webinars we've been running lately if you've been tuning in. He has expertly guided NLI's approach to allyship, authoring a number of articles on the topic and advising clients on how they can approach it. Mr. Khalil Smith. Hello, Khalil.
Hello, Gabe.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. You ready to kick us off?
I am ready to kick us off. Thank you so much for the introduction and welcome to everyone. It's always wonderful to look through the chat and see everyone, all the different places that you're joining from. Paulette and Marshall, I will give you a brief reprieve on being on video. As I'm going to share some slides and then I'm going to come to you for the vast majority of our time together. But thank you so much, everyone. And Gabe, following your advice, I've got my notebook to the side with my pen. I closed out a lot of my other applications and I am really looking forward to this conversation. Many of you that have been on kind of other webinars or listened to other events that we've done know that we kind of tend to go back and forth. Sometimes we have a really, really strong point of view on something. It's always grounded in the science. We know exactly what our point of view is. And then there are other times that we really want to continue to hear from you because our point of view is evolving and we're taking in lots of input. And so all of those comments that I see in the chat right now and all of the things that you're doing to kind of participate, we want to keep those going. So please, as we're having this conversation, toss in your ideas. We're going to stop at a couple really deliberate moments and make sure that you really are engaged and that you're giving us your point of view, that we're hearing from you around what Act Boldly means for you, what you've seen done in your own organization and in other organizations. And what you'd like to see done going forward. So I'm going to share my screen for a little bit. And before we get into Act Boldly, what I want to do is just kind of take us back a little bit. Because as Gabe said, this is a part of a 3-part series that we've done. And really, Act Boldly is the final part of kind of our larger narrative. And so that narrative consists of listen deeply, unite widely, act boldly. And we'll put in the chat the kind of article that Dr. David Rock and I initially put in Forbes that really pulled together some of our thinking around what leaders needed to do when we first wrote it and need to continue to do to really make sure that they are leading appropriately in this moment of social change and justice and racial unrest. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we've done already and what we've talked about in the last 2 webinars over the last 2 weeks, and then kind of use that to kind of anchor us on where we're going to go as it relates to Act Boldly. So first and foremost, if you're tuning in with Neuro Leadership Institute, you know that we always follow the science and we always recommend that you do the same. So you'll hear us reference some of the science specifically in some places, but always underlying in other places. And part of that informed the first webinar that we did as well, which is this idea of where do we need to listen? What are we talking about when we talk about listen deeply? And there were really a handful of spaces where we can be listening deeply or kind of different modalities or ways of connecting with other folks. And so one of them is one-to-one, right? It can potentially be the most intimate. It really allows people the opportunity to be heard, really that kind of one-on-one interaction. There are also teams, right, where you can create that team space. And so I'll speak a little bit about this on the next slide. And we spoke about this in the webinar that actually Paulette was a part of and led some pretty significant parts of 2 weeks ago. And then across the entire organization. So we know lots and lots of organizations are thinking about how do we listen deeply across our entire population and really hear everything that people are experiencing right now. And that can be done in a handful of ways. One is listening circles. So you'll hear a little bit about that. We've been tapped by lots of organizations to dig in and really help them understand how to run listening circles or to bring us in to do that work with them. Focus groups obviously continue to be really important in this moment in time as we think about how to listen deeply. Town halls, where leaders are communicating information and really disseminating really valuable info and points of view and strategic goals and direction for the organization. And surveys. Surveys are another great way to get lots and lots of information and to listen deeply across your organization. And so if you're asking yourself, well, when might this be right for different times, and what's some of the difference between them, and what are the pros and cons between them, you're in luck, because we spent an entire webinar pulling that apart. And so we can definitely kind of link you to that, and would be happy for you to dig in there. And so when we think about scaling listening deeply, because we always want to think about what does this mean in terms of the broadest level of what we can do? Because absolutely, as a manager or as a fellow employee, we want to go deep one-on-one. And yet many of you are working in organizations of 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people and trying to think about how do we respond right now? And so there are a couple of different options. You can deliver these types of experiences yourself. You can do what some others have done, which is call an external partner to help deliver and manage these experiences. Or you can enable some or all of your people managers to be able to deliver these types of experiences. So there are lots of different ways to approach this, but the essence of what we truly believe is that before you can do any of these other elements, you absolutely need to listen deeply to what's going on inside of your organization. So then we get to uniting widely, and what does uniting widely mean? So last week we were fortunate enough to spend some time with two really amazing scientists that walked us through, well, what does it mean to try to create a really strong in-group? And part of what we talked about, kind of the difference between in-group and out-group, can really be boiled down into a couple things. And it's very complex, there's a lot going on, but if we think about perception, empathy, and motivation, that when I feel like you are a part of my in-group or you feel like I'm a part of yours, I am more motivated to help and to participate. We believe and feel more empathy for the other person. And we perceive things more favorably and faster, right? Like we actually get there more quickly. And so there are immense benefits to creating a universal in-group and to really bringing people together. And then we started to dig a little bit into, so how do you do that? And while we won't go super deep into it today, because we absolutely want to get to act boldly, there are really three things that we found in the research and that we continue to anchor on. And those three things that you can do to unite widely are to increase exposure. So by increasing exposure, what we mean is bringing together people and groups that would not otherwise have access to one another. And so just the simple fact of being in the same space, interacting, seeing one another, being in shared locations can be really beneficial. Now we know as soon as I say locations, we go to physical locations, and we know that for many of us, we're not back in the return to workspace yet, although obviously some are, and yet these don't need to be physical locations. They can be virtual. How are we using platforms like Zoom and WebEx and GoToMeeting and Microsoft Teams to create these environments where people are coming together who might not otherwise come together? And it's almost even more important right now. And then experiences, right? Shared experiences are incredibly powerful for bringing groups together. And so it's why you see team building activities, or why you see when people build a home together or go off and do something together, whether that's a bowling outing or any other type of experience, there can be some real benefits in terms of kind of creating that in-group that we're looking for. And then last and certainly not least, there's tons and tons of research around shared goals. And this idea that superordinate goals or shared goals or things that we can't accomplish on our own, that we really need other people for, and those other people are benefiting us and getting closer to our goals, are incredibly powerful for creating in-group. And so as we think about all of those benefits, the perception, the motivation, the empathy, and what we want to do as we think about uniting widely in the face of extremely divisive forces, whether that is being remote or some of the polarization that we all have talked about and dealt with, there are things that we can and must do as leaders and as fellow employees in our organizations all over the world to bring people together. And so we're going to talk about a lot of that. But what I'd love to do now, before I start diving too much into Act Boldly, is invite Marshall and Paulette, you back in, if you wouldn't mind, just to say, and I'm going to stop sharing screen for a moment, anything that resonates with you about what we've been talking about in terms of listen deeply and unite widely, that kind of jumps out at you. And again, folks, would love, love, love for you to put some comments in the chats that we can react to those as well. But Paulette, maybe I'll come to you first because you were a key part of that Listen Deeply webinar.
Yeah, the thing that keeps occurring to me actually is a contrast between two clients who recently took a crack at this listening deeply thing. In one case, leadership set out to listen to literally about 30,000 employees and did just that. Listened without judgment, listened without interrupting or commenting. In another case, and we heard from employees that this really bombed, leadership read some books based on recent events, got themselves educated and knowledgeable on certain topics, and then held listening sessions where they did a lot of the talking based on what they had read. And we heard from employees that it came off as contrived and condescending. So the point there was really that first listening piece versus the second was it was authentic, and there was some vulnerability there, and there was actual listening, as opposed to sort of the performance of listening. That really struck me as an interesting contrast.
Love that. Thank you, Paulette. What about you, Marshall? What's jumping out at you?
So reflecting on what Paulette said, I think another aspect of doing listening right is recognizing the fact that we don't all know how to listen well. Listening well is a skill that can be developed. After 25 years of marriage, I still have not mastered it, but I am trying to get better. And there are some best practices that can really turn an event, which is a listening event, into something positive or something negative. And so, Paulette gave a few of the hints. So, seriously, just listening, not commenting, asking questions to deeply understand as opposed to challenge someone's point of view, just engaging the person, looking at them. So there's different skills. And for those of you who've been through some of the NLI coaching programs like brain-based coaching, coaching lays a good fundamentals for how to listen to people. And so I would encourage folks, not just consider how you're going to run a listening sessions, but how are you preparing the folks who are running those listening sessions to actually listen and listen well.
Yeah, love that. Good. Thank you so much. Those are amazing reflections. And I'm already starting to see some folks putting some things in the chat. So thank you. It's doing us proud to see the comments coming through, and want to continue to see lots and lots more of those. Similarly, actually, we want to hear from you right now. So Act Boldly, I'm going to give you a bit of a definition around it, but I'm going to hold off on giving you some of what we think Act Boldly is, because we really want to hear from you first. And so the first thing that I'm going to ask, and would love to hear from as many people as possible. We've got hundreds of people on the line, and LinkedIn Live as well. And even if you're listening to this as a part of a podcast or something, would love for you to kind of take the moment, take the time, and really do some of this reflection. The question I'm asking now are, which bold actions by any company have inspired you and why? So again, any company, anything that you've seen over the kind of past 2 or 3 months in responses to some of the social justice challenges, in response to the things that organizations are trying to figure out, and those can be either internal or external. And you'll hear us kind of separate those out a little bit, because there are the things that organizations do externally, and there are the things that organizations do internally. But I'm going to leave this question up for a moment, and then Paulette and Marshall, maybe we'll just kind of comb through the chat and see what are some of the key themes that are coming up for folks. I'll give it about another 15 seconds. And while I'm sharing, I can't quite see the chat, so I'm just assuming that there's all sorts of wonderfulness coming through that we can dig into. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. And Paulette, maybe I will come to you first. What are you seeing in the chat that jumps out to you? Any themes or anything in particular that really kind of strikes you as acting boldly?
Yeah, I'm struck, and I'm just stuck on this comment about Mississippi changing their flag. I mean, what an example. I mean, in some ways, we could have done this a long time ago, but truly, truly a bold step. and lots of wonderful examples of things that companies are doing to demonstrate, again, real authenticity. So there are a lot of great examples here of CEOs or executive teams or HR simply listening and taking in the information as opposed to trying to be reactive, which I think is a real shift from what we've seen in the past. There's humility here.
Yeah, love that. Marshall, what about you? What are you seeing in some of these comments?
Yeah, I see a few which are really focused on like raising up different voices, which I think is incredibly powerful as well. So I think, you know, one of the bedrocks of our inclusion work is that if you're not actively including, you may be accidentally excluding. And so I saw a comment there around Zoom meetings, lift every voice 3 days a week, facilitated, themes shared with leadership. So, you know, these sorts of proactive actions, and, you know, we can almost call them habits, you know, at the end of the day, Analyze in a habit formation business, or these systems that are going to continue to raise these voices can have a huge impact. And I think going back to that whole concept of listening, one of the other things that we've heard is, or we've been advising as well with our clients is, yes, you can do these listening circles, but listening is going to need to continue. Right? We need to continue to have systems and processes in place where we can continue to hear people. This isn't a one, oh, I've heard you, now we'll fix it all. Yeah. This is what's happened now over the next 3 months. Just think about, you know, even, you know, so we can consider the racial injustice, the murder of George Floyd, that has created a lot of need for listening. But we're going to need to be doing a lot of listening over the next 6 months. We've got an election coming up. We've got a country that's very divided. So building that practice of listening and building systems where people constantly have that forum so that it's not just a surprise or should we do listening on this topic or not, will allow for much more robust dialogue.
Yeah, and Marshall, I think one of the things you said there that is so worthy of kind of really pulling out is that even the model in the way that we've described it, listen deeply, unite widely, act boldly, is not linear, and it's not with an end point. Right? It doesn't, okay, well, now that we've acted boldly, we're done, so can we move on to the next thing? But after we've acted, how are we going back and saying, so how did that feel, folks? And what worked and what didn't? And how do we now come back together? Because we know our natural tendency is during these times of kind of stress or challenges, we can absolutely come together. And then we start to fragment a little bit more. And maybe you've got the sales and the marketing team or research and development and, you know, and procurement are starting to say, well, I don't know that we're really on the same page anymore. And so as a leadership team, as fellow employees, it is our responsibility to, as you said, constantly be listening, constantly be uniting, constantly be thinking about what are the bold actions that we can take that are not bold just for the sake of being bold, but that they really are driving us forward and driving us in the right direction. That's awesome. I'm going to ask another question, and you all brought it on yourself because your comments were so incredible. Now I'm just going to keep peppering you with questions, but I'm going to share my screen again. Before this last question was, which bold actions by any company have inspired you and why? The next question that I have for you is, what has your company done to act boldly? So would love to understand anything that you would say. And I know in some instances, folks already had started to add a little bit of that into the chat, that our team has started to do this. I saw some comments around folks saying that their organization is now providing, 2 hours a week for people to kind of learn and listen outside of their kind of area of expertise. Others talked about creating new accountability groups and new kind of employee resource groups. So would love to dig deeper into that as well and understand what are some of the things your company is doing that you would say you kind of categorize under act boldly. Again, let's see what is coming through for folks.
Khalil, I'm really struck by the number of comments here from folks who say their company is encouraging white employees to interrogate their whiteness and to think about their culture, what they bring to the table and what it means to be white in the workplace. A year ago, I don't think we could have imagined something like that happening. So incredibly important. I think that's bold.
And that means a lot, coming from you, Paula. Like you've been in this diversity and inclusion space. You've been a chief diversity officer. You've done this work over and over and over again. And so to hear that something this bold is happening and that there really has been a shift and that people are reflecting really deeply as well. So when we say listen deeply, it's not only listening to others, that is primarily it, but there's also a part of reflection, right? Marshall, I think to your point, one of the skills of listening is kind of getting out of your own head and just being there with the other person, but then taking it away a little bit and thinking about like, why am I having the reactions that I am? And how am I filtering information? And why when this person said this thing did I react in this way, but when this other person said it, I reacted very differently. And to your point around our habits, I mean, the number of people I've heard say, you taught us about seeds and now I hear differently or I understand things differently is critically important. What else is jumping out at you? I'm just scrolling down. I see 23 new messages in the chat, so I love it.
It's impossible to follow, but I will say that what I'm inspired by is the diversity of what people think is bold. And I think that that's really important for us to consider as well. Different organizations are in different places right now, and that's okay. What one organization thinks is bold may for another organization be a step that they took last year, but that's all right. We're all on this journey. If your boldness is finally we got to hire a chief diversity officer, fantastic. I mean, that may be something you've been trying to make happen in your organization for 10 years. So that's amazing. And build on that, right? So I think that sometimes there's this little one-upsmanship. Oh, if my company was only this, we could do so much more. Look at the company you're in, look at the organization you have, look at the communities they serve, and figure out what you can do in order to make a difference. And I think that that's fantastic. So, I'm just inspired by the different levels of boldness and the fact that we're all excited that these things are happening.
I love it. And Marshall, you're going right to something that I wanted to pull up on another slide. So the dovetail is beautiful here. And I said I would kind of give a little bit of our working definition of act boldly, because we've done that in terms of, listening deeply and unite widely. Like, what do we mean when we talk about this? And so you touched on a number of these, and Paula and Marshall would love to hear your perspectives. But even for folks that can't see the slide, the first is bold looks very different everywhere. So to your point, Marshall, there are companies that are, billion-dollar companies that are donating $100 million. And if the rest of us say, well, I'm not that big, so I can't do any of those things, and just give up or decide not to go after it, I feel like there's a lot of lost opportunity there. And so exactly what you're describing, that like do the thing that really works for you, which I think goes right to the second point, be coherent and strategic, right? Find the things that really fit with your organization. And I know you both have some examples of that, so I'm going to give you some space because I'd love for you to share them with our attendees. This third one is a bit of a challenge for some folks. Pretending to be bold can be fraught. And what we mean by that is we know what bold looks like in an organization, right? And you learn some of that as a part of the listening sessions. And so if you happen to be one of those $100 billion companies and you say, hey, everybody, we're going to donate $1 million, people know that that doesn't really feel bold. And it's not only about the money, it's not only, but like putting out the statement and saying, we think this is bad. Okay, everybody, we checked the box. Now we want to move on. We know that our populations are not okay with the check the box mentality. And so if we check the box and call it bold, there are a lot of places that are struggling with some of that. And then this last one, good ideas can come when crowdsourced internally. And so we know some of the best ideas come from the organization, and that's why listening deeply is so important, and that's why it leads to acting boldly. So would love to give you both, just a couple minutes to kind of touch on a couple of these that really jump out to you. And Marshall, maybe I'll start with you if that's okay, and then Paulette, come to you.
Sure. Happy to share. So I was actually having a conversation with one of our clients, General Mills Corporation. So for those who don't know, General Mills is 35,000 employees, about a $17 billion company. They're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So really at the epicenter of, where the George Floyd murder happened and where all of this racial justice movement, well, it did not begin then, but it got a lot more momentum, let's say. And so they were right in the middle of this situation, and they've always had commitments towards diversity and inclusion. If you look at the representation within their organization, their numbers are actually quite good when it comes to people of color, Black, et cetera. But they've done what I think are some really bold, interesting actions, but they also are aligned with what they do as an organization. So getting back to that concept up there at the top, like be coherent and strategic, at the end of the day, General Mills is really good at making food. They have been producing Cheerios. They've been keeping us fed during the COVID crisis. They knew how to get their people into the factories, keep them safe, and keep America fed. So they've got a really unique skill set. Their people are really talented at developing food. So what is their commitment towards social justice? They've made a commitment towards bringing food equality. So they know that they're great at distributing food. They know that they're great at producing food. So they're going to focus on making sure that all people of color have equal access to high quality, nutritious food. Makes total sense, and also something that will make a big difference. What are they also good at? They also have a program, I don't know if you know, with the box tops on the top of those things where they donate money to schools. They've raised over $1 billion to schools. Now, that program that they've done has typically been focused on the communities where people are, but that money could actually be shifted to be given to neighborhoods and communities where more education dollars are needed. So they've made a commitment to leverage that program to direct more funding towards schools and communities where more budget and money is needed that have been typically underserved. They also waded into a really dangerously political topic, which was, should we reform the police? They were in Minneapolis, and I'm sure they have tons of employees who are related or married to police members, but their CEO stepped in and said, we need to make police reform a priority in our city. And they lobbied with state legislatures, and they've started to make that change. So to me, the key things, and last but not least, General Mills has an amazing allyship program. We'll actually put the link in here. And this is something they built without us. This is not an NLI plug at all. This is their own work. But they made that free to anyone. So if you want to go and learn about a great allyship program, all the materials are available on their website. And they not only made it available, but they sent those materials to all of their suppliers. So if you think about the amazing supply chain that General Mills must have, all of their suppliers, and they offered free advice and coaching in order to help them set up their own allyship programs in their supplier organizations as well. So to me, there's just a great combination of leveraging what an organization is good at, making a bold step to not just focus on internal changes, but focus on systemic changes throughout their community and the community that they actually can have an impact over. So, kudos to General Mills, really excited to see this sort of work, and, just one example of many that are out there.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Marshall. We may have to try and get them on another one of our webinars so they can talk a little bit more deeply about what they do.
I literally just found it out yesterday. I would have had them on, I said.
Paulette, what about you? What's jumping out at you as you look across some of these?
What's jumping out as I'm listening to Marshall talk is this idea of acting boldly around systems or systemic change, and acting boldly as an individual or behaviorally. And I think, they're both, there are wonderful examples in both categories of how one can be really bold. But the fact that there seems to be so much systemic change being kicked off in the past few months is really remarkable. And it also links back, Khalil, to your comment about coherence and being strategic. So what does it mean to be bold around systemic change in a way that fits with your organization? So for example, we have one client who is working to make diversity goals part of executives' overall performance goals. So not just linking diversity representation to a percentage of the manager's overall compensation or bonus, which we have seen done in the past, but this is literally a performance goal. So that's a pretty bold systemic kind of change. That said, that is not going to work in every organization. So it's one thing to understand your culture and your strategy and what fits in it, and it's quite another to look out at some of these bold best practices and say, well, I'm just going to take that unmodified and try to instill it in my organization. Might not work so well. So that's a really important piece to keep in mind too.
Yeah. I love that. And actually with that in mind, again, I'm going to, keep peppering our participants and attendees with questions. And this particular question is, I've asked you what your organization is doing to act boldly. What would you like your company to do to act boldly? This is just useful kind of for me, quite honestly, selfishly, to understand what are some of the things that are kind of our moonshots, or the things that we would say, if I could, I would love for my company to be doing this. This is what I would pursue perceived to really be acting boldly. And you've seen quite a number of the other things that people are referencing in the chat, or even in some of the examples that have been provided just now. And so we'll give you a couple moments to kind of pop some things into the chat there to tell us a little bit about what you want your organization to do to act boldly. And while you're doing that, Marshall, I would love, and again, I'll pop this back up, if you could just talk a little bit about what our organization has done to act boldly, and I'll prime that with a slide.
Oh, thank you, Khalil. So yeah, this is actually a really interesting story. I'll try to make it brief, but when we started to do some webinars on, listen deeply, unite widely, act boldly, we felt that we needed to make a stand and sort of, set the stage for ourselves and say, well, what does it look like for us to act boldly? And I'll say, I would love to say that this was a super well strategically thought out decision made by the leadership team. But frankly, it was something that I think David Rock, our founder, had a good instinct on, but it does meet with a lot of those criteria we talked about. So what we decided we offer was to create a free de-escalation webinar for state and federal law enforcement agencies. What this basically was leveraging what NLI is great at, which is understanding human behavior and understanding concepts of social threat, physical threat, what it does to the brain, and leveraging that to provide some sort of training for law enforcement who clearly are continually in a threat state, and that threat state can sometimes lead to very bad decisions and very bad outcomes. And frankly, when I heard this, I had no idea whether or not we could be helpful in this space at all. I frankly assumed that most law enforcement organizations already had this sort of training. Well, fast forward 2 months later now, and our little mighty team of folks here at NLI who've taken this mission on have, gotten us to the point where I think in 2 weeks from now, we'll be piloting our first program with law enforcement agencies. And not only that, but we've built an entire network and partnership of folks who do law enforcement training who actually have been on this mission for a long time. And we're looking for someone like us to help them. We had no idea they were out there. They had no idea we were there with them. So just to share, we're now partnering with a simulation company that does sort of the use of force simulation trainings. You've probably seen on TV when there's a potential perpetrator and the policeman or the first responder has to decide how to handle that. Should they use force? Should they not use force? We're also partnering with a gentleman, and I would highly recommend you watch this HBO video. It's an HBO movie, Ernie and Joe. Joe Samaro is a police officer in San Antonio. He also has an amazing TED Talk, but he is part of a first responder team that just handles situations where people are having some sort of a, psychological breakdown. So they have a whole separate force there that deals with those situations. And as those who've been reading about this is actually something that lots of first responders have to deal with, but yet they're not trained for. So yeah, at the end of the day, not only has this, sort of inspired our organization and moved us in a direction, but we've actually found a group of people that needed our help and we're partnering together. So, going back, we don't have to go back to that slide. I know we talked about it earlier on, Khalil, but so just for us, it really has exposed us to new people. Mm-hmm. It has built relatedness between a group of folks that we had never really even considered part of our community of NLI believers. And now it looks like, hopefully we'll be making a change, and we're hoping to have some of them on an upcoming webinar when we start season 2. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I love that. The exposure, experience, and shared goals that we spoke about before. So much around that unite widely. Thank you so much, Marshall. That's super helpful. So I do, I've kept putting people in the chat, Gabe or Anna in the background. I'd love to maybe put up one of the first polls that we had, because we've talked about some of the work that has been done externally and the work that is being done internally. And so we just love to understand from you all kind of what is that percentage breakdown as you look across your organization. So are you finding that your company is focusing more of your attention internally or all of your attention internally? So for those of you that can't see the poll, we've got a couple different options here. So my company's actions to act boldly have been focused 0% external and 100% internal, 25% external, 75% internal, and so on and so forth, from kind of 50-50 to 75% external to 100% external. And the final option, we have not done anything bold, and I would add yet to that, because we are a growth mindset organization, and so we know that it's only a matter of time before it comes. And so we'll give maybe like another 5 to 10 seconds for folks to add here. And just kind of part of what we're seeing is kind of right out of the gate, 25% external and 75% internal has about 40% of our votes total. So let's shut that down in probably like another 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Amazing. So we ended with about 43% of the respondents saying that the company has been 25% external and 75% internal. Quite honestly, I don't know that we have a really strong point of view yet on what the right balance is. We will absolutely tell you, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that you've got to focus on the things internally as well. So I know some people may have been responding in slightly different ways in terms of how much attention you've been focusing or kind of what you've already announced. But just personally, that feels like about the right balance to me, that there is definitely some external work that's being done. And yet, you know, from so many of the comments that we hear from people in those listening sessions, or even what we've seen in the comments, is people saying, you know, some of the external stuff can be great, but let's create a different environment internally. Let's make sure that when we add that diversity to our organization, that we're also adding inclusion. Let's make sure that our people really do have opportunities to grow and develop and kind of push things forward. And Marshall, I think your point around General Mills, that like we've got unique capabilities and we don't only want to hoard those things internally, we also want to make the world a better place and contribute some of our unique talents externally. So that's why 25 and 75 kind of feels kind of right to me in terms of the split. Thank you everyone for your comments there. And Paulette, Marshall, anything you would add before we kind of keep moving? All right, some head nods to a no. So the only other thing that I want to kind of chat about here, and I'll bring our screen back up so you can see, is this idea of priorities, right? Right now, there are so many things that are happening in organizations, and you can kind of, you know, if you can see the slide, you can see the list. There are lots of different things, whether those are town halls or public statements, or, you know, Marcia, you brought up hiring a chief diversity officer, targets. Paulette, you were talking about this a little bit, like really weaving those into the organization, accountability, buying new technology. Each of these things, and I say this all the time when we bring up this type of slide, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of the things that we have here, right? They are all incredible first steps. And yet, if you hire a chief diversity officer and yet you don't give them a budget or a team or a voice or any type of presence in the organization, if they don't report into someone with real power to make things happen, then they can just become a bit of a kind of a, I don't know, a figurehead almost, if you will, right? And so each of these things should be in service to something else. And for anybody that's followed our work for some time, you'll recognize that as soon as we start talking about priorities, we usually also talk about the other two, because so often we get kind of anchored on the priorities, anchored on the statement or the kind of big splash, and we forget about the habits, which is exactly what we were just describing in the chat and exactly what we were just talking about in terms of maybe 25% external and 75% internal. What are the things that we expect people to see or hear or speak or do differently in our organization, given our priorities? And then our systems. How are our systems reinforcing our priorities and our habits to make it easy to create that behavior change? Because so many of us want to have been doing the right thing and think that in a lot of instances we have been doing the right thing. And so now that our eyes have been opened, and you know, Paulette, you brought up the example before of conversations that are happening that never would have happened previously. How do we capitalize on those conversations and capitalize on those moments and really bake them into our habits and our systems as well, so that we don't need to come back to this moment, but we use this as a jumping off point and use this as in our organization as the moment where we really decided to change things and to act boldly and to do things differently. So Marshall, I know you've spoken a ton about priorities, habits, systems. Paulette, I know you've done a lot of this work with organizations through our D&I efforts. So maybe Paulette, I'll come to you first this time, if you don't mind, and just get your reactions on priorities, habits, and systems. And then Marshall, would love to hear from you.
Well, what really struck me as you were talking and I'm watching the chat is a lot of folks are talking about sustainability and is everything that's going on now, particularly the bold actions, just a moment in time. And 3 months from now, we will be onto something else. I certainly hope not. And I was thinking the priority habits and system model is such a wonderful way to address that question around sustainability. The priorities, that actually might be the easiest piece, bold as it may be, of that entire process. But now that we're seeing all these types of systems changes going into effect, I think, Marshall's example of General Mills was extraordinary. Those are the sorts of things that will sustain this momentum and actually make change versus, some of the comments I'm seeing here about a company making a statement over email and leaving the action. It's simply that. That's not really fitting into that PHS model.
Yeah, love it. Marshall, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, the thing that I find is interesting when I have these conversations with clients is many organizations right now have the energy, the momentum, and the license to make significant changes. So they're coming to us and they're saying, what should we do? So we've made this a priority. The CEO and the executive suite have said, this is important to us, but now what should we do? What's the best way for us to leverage this momentum to make the biggest change? And I would say that, there are two different ways to think about it, and they're both valuable, but they have different time frames, right? So when I think about habits, I think about habits as something that you can actually build in people relatively quick, not relatively easily, but relatively quickly, that will start to have a change immediately. So just for an example, when folks go through our Decide Unconscious Bias training, after 30 days, they can start regularly to practice the habit of mitigating bias 1 time per week. So if you're an organization like General Mills with 35,000 employees times 52 weeks, that leads to, within a couple of months, you can have people behaving differently in a way that's going to mitigate unconscious bias, that's going to make people feel more included, that's going to raise up voices. So training, or good training that's going to drive behavior change, can have an immediate impact right away. Changing systems can take time. It's harder. I mean, for those who have been trying to remove performance ratings perhaps, or those who are trying to change the way that we do compensation in our organizations, or change the way that we recruit, those things are difficult and they take time. They will have the longest lasting impact, as Paulette said, but you might not see that value right away. So what we're recommending is some combination of both, where you can start to have an impact immediately on daily behaviors, daily interactions that people have with work every day, while working on those systems to create a new foundation that will, continue to support that change over time. So it doesn't have to be an either or, but I think it's really important for people to understand what's the time frame. When do we want to see an impact, and make some decisions based on that.
Love it. Awesome. Well, I want to kind of transition into some of the questions that have been coming in. And so for everybody that's listening, please, drop your questions in, and on LinkedIn Live as well, please, contribute your questions, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can over the next few minutes. But Paulette, maybe I'll come to you for this first one. Danny asked the question, how do you keep employee resource groups from becoming siloed? So I feel like in some ways, those have become a way to act boldly, that organizations are saying, we want to listen deeply, so we'll create these, these groups. How do you keep them from becoming siloed? What's been your experience and your advice?
Such a great question. And I was just talking to a client about this yesterday, and essentially the evolution or the maturity of something like an employee resource group. Often they start at the ground up as affinity groups where like-minded folks can come together just to feel less alone. But as they mature to networks and ERGs and even BRGs, business resource groups, they begin to connect their goals to the overall business goals, right? So General Electric, I think, has always been a really interesting example of this. They have an incredibly powerful women's network that sets its annual goals every year in alignment with the business's annual goals. So they're constantly preparing their members to meet the goals of the business. That's the best way to keep them from being siloed and really integrated into all of the business functions.
Awesome. Just coming off mute. I was scrolling through some of the Q&A and I didn't want you to hear my clicks over and over again. A question that came in from LinkedIn Live, and Marshall, maybe I'll direct this one to you because you spoke so passionately about listening. Someone asked, what kind of listening skills have you found to be most effective? I feel like you touched on that a little bit, but I'd love for you to maybe go a little deeper if there's anything else that you would say, or that your wife would say, are the effective listening skills.
So from my NLI frame, and by the way, Khalil, I saw a question that I'm going to send to you afterwards, if you're okay with that, because
I
am. So I think from an NLI perspective, one of the things that's really important is this whole concept of empathy. So having and creating empathy is at the end of the day, our job when we're listening is not to solve problems. It's literally to listen. The act of people being heard has value, and you just have to accept that fact. That's again, going back to my marriage, that's one of the things that I did not realize for a very long time. But Brene Brown does amazing work on that. There's amazing videos you can see on that. But just saying like, wow, I understand, I hear you, you've been heard. There's incredible power in that. And that's enough. You don't need to do more. So that's one thing. Number two, creating a safe space for people to talk is incredibly powerful as well. So we talk, there's tons of research on psychological safety. At NLI, we use the SCARF model, which is our model for understanding the concept of social threat and reward. But, there are things in that model. For example, the SCARF model says people can be threatened by status. So if I walk into a meeting as the Senior Vice President of Corporate Solutions, it is going to have an impact on the way that people will talk and the way that people will feel comfortable talking. So I need to be aware of that, and I need to take mitigating steps to make sure that that does not impede the act of listening, right? So to me, those, so psychological safety would be one. Number two is the concept of empathy. And so to me, those are two of the things that we teach. There's a whole bunch more, but to me personally, those are some of the things that I've been using on a regular basis.
That's awesome. Thank you. I was going to keep asking you questions, so you can't ask me one, but I'll let it in.
So Khalil, Janelle asked this question: how do you advise organizations who are overwhelming Black employees with additional work, especially for free? And I'm assuming that means like educating their white colleagues, or so. And I know that that's something that we've had to find that balance in our organization as well. So tell me about that.
Yeah. I mean, I will go back to, I think, this idea of listening deeply. And it's to your point, Marshall, to understand how people are feeling, because I've spoken to lots and lots of Black family members, coworkers, people at other organizations. And an article that I wrote a while ago kind of began with this idea that Black people are not a monolith, right? There's not one kind of style. And so personally, I love the fact that people are now saying, hey, I want to know more. I'm curious. I'm interested. How can I lean in? Can we have a conversation? What I love even more than that is when people recognize that there is an impact associated with that. And so they say like, hey, I recognize you've probably got a lot going on. If you're available to chat, I would love to. If not, could you either recommend someone else or maybe recommend some resources or materials that could be useful? And as I've spoken with people, it is that awareness of the impact that you may be having that is so important, which is to say, hey, listen, I want to learn, and I don't just want to go off and read a bunch of books. And Paulette, you brought this up before, right? Go off and do my own education, but never validate that against the people who are in my closest circle or the ones who will be influenced by the decisions that I want to make. But it's also not your responsibility to educate me completely and wholly. And so how do we find this balance of, Khalil, I want to understand your experience, but your experience is actually different than my brother who's 2 years older than me, his experience. We grew up in the same household, we share a lot of things, and yet if you were to ask us about our experiences, they would be different. And our experiences in organizations are different. And so it's about getting out and listening to people, but also to the point, and it's a great question, starting to recognize that leading an employee resource group, doing some of this additional work, it is in addition to the work that other people are already doing. And not very many people are sitting around with their feet up on a desk just waiting for people to ask them their perspective. And so if we're already dealing with children and COVID-19 and stress and frustration and workloads and sales goals and all of this, just some level of awareness and some understanding that this is in addition to all of those things, and an integration into how does that fit into my overall performance can be incredibly helpful.
Thanks, Khalil. And Khalil's been great in the organization, so generous with his time, and so helpful to many people. So thank you, Khalil.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, I'm recognizing that we're right at like 50 after. So Marshall and Paulette, I mean, we've got a couple things I want to wrap up. So please, folks, stay on the line. But just an amazing and huge thank you for all of your insights, your stories, your recommendations, your just your vulnerability around having this type of conversation. And you both have been incredible leaders in this space. And so I know for many of the folks that are on the line, for myself as well, I get a ton every time I listen to you speak about this. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen again and put a couple other things up. Please don't go anywhere because we definitely want to continue to get your point of view on some things. I'm going to put 2 polls up. The first one is anonymous. All of our polls are anonymous unless otherwise stated. But Gabe/Anna would love to put up the one. There we go. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. But I'm just curious, based on your company's reaction to kind of this current moment in time, are you much more likely to leave your current employer, slightly more likely to leave your current employer, unaffected in your decision, same as it was before, slightly more likely to stay, much more likely to stay, or not applicable? I'm either a sole proprietor or currently not employed, or this question just doesn't apply to me. So again, that's why I bring up that it's anonymous, because we will not be sending these to anybody or ascribing them to anybody in particular. But it is just good to know how companies are doing in terms of these reactions and whether or not it is having the effect that I think a lot of organizations would want it to have, which is engendering more trust, engendering more loyalty, and letting people know that we really do care about them as individuals and as employees. So I'll leave this up for about another 5 seconds and then kind of close it down. So 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's a pretty largely equitable distribution that about 6% much more likely to leave, 9% slightly more likely to leave, 18% in both unaffected and slightly more likely to stay, with the largest share at 29% at much more likely to stay at my current employer. So love seeing that, love that we've got folks that have really seen the effort that their organizations are putting in and